All right. Hey, everyone. Thank you for joining. Welcome to today's webinar, Road Mapping Cloud Migration and Architecture. Before I hand over to our speakers today, Peter Collins and Liam Ryan, I'd just like to go through a few housekeeping things. Please ensure your microphone is muted. If you have any questions, comments, etc., place them in the chat window below, and we'll try to answer all the questions at the end. Today's session will be recorded, which will be available after the webinar. I will now pass the presentation to Liam Ryan, our Growth and Marketing Manager of Asia.
Thank you, Harrison, and welcome to everyone else that's joining today. I can see the attendees are still filling up, but good to have everyone join nice and early. So before we get into the details of today's webinar, I'll just give you a bit of a background on Avolution and, of course, Abacus. If you haven't spoken with us before, if this is your first time interacting with us, welcome. But to give you a bit of a background on where we are today, Avolution has been around for nearly 20 years. We've actually had many more years in R&D as well before that. We are a global organization, of course, so we have 7 offices worldwide, and we are this year expanding quite heavily into Asia with more of a presence in Singapore, as we're seeing EA really start to mature in the region. A bit of a recent announcement on that, actually. So TOGAF certifications, in fact, have passed or surpassed 11,000 users now in India, over 3,000 in China, and there's thousands more now in Singapore, Indonesia, the Philippines, Hong Kong, Malaysia, and Thailand. So there's some of our key areas, actually, that we're focusing on this year. Avolution, of course, is a market leader. So you may have seen reports from both Gartner and Forrester, so very highly rated both as an organization for Avolution and in our capabilities as a tool as well. We have users in over 100 different countries, and very proud to say that over 3,000 organizations, including enterprises and government departments, have worked with us. So I'm joined by Peter Collins as well, who is our APAC region manager. He is leading the way in our Asia Pacific endeavors and is one of the core parts of our product team as well. Let's start jumping into a bit of the reason why we're here today to talk about, of course, cloud migration and road mapping. So cloud itself can still be quite complex and challenging. It was, of course, this golden promise, or certainly that's the way it was pitched to many different people and many different business stakeholders. There is, of course, now quite a bit of frustration in the general business community. And we can see from the few quotes on the screen that there is a few different opinions out there. These are gathered from InfoWorld, from David, at the Chief Cloud Strategy Officer. And it just sort of underpins that there's a real requirement for solid planning and architecture to have this all run smoothly. So for any cloud endeavor, any road mapping endeavor, you really do need that solid planning and architecture. And without that, that's where you start to face a lot of this cloud backlash or cloud repatriation, which is being prompted by those failed migrations. Diving down a little bit deeper into some of those key issues and some of the initial concerns from the community, which we've gathered from Gartner and Computer Weekly. And this is all based on feedback from varying different stakeholders across organizations and enterprises. Quite a few migrations have been delayed due to unforeseen factors. Sometimes you can't plan things. Unfortunately, that's just the way things are. I'm sure if you joined our other road mapping webinar earlier this year, you would have heard us talk about who was the driving force for digital transformation in your organization. Was it your business leaders? Was it your IT team? For the majority of people, it was actually the global pandemic. So that is some of those unforeseen factors that you can't always do plan for. You can plan that there will be unforeseen factors, but you can't always plan for each individual one. Of course, with the move to home, working from home for a lot of people, and of course, a lot of digitization of services and platforms, quite a lot of people are concerned about security. So nearly half, well, certainly well over a quarter, are concerned about the security of their cloud systems. And of course, nearly 40% hadn't realized the total costs. So when your CFO comes to you and says, oh, we need to reduce the costs and cut off some of these unused servers or unused applications and use some cloud-based software, they may not have realized the costs overall. As these things scale, they can start to get a little bit more expensive. So that's one thing to look out for. And of course, a big part of EA is all about mitigating these issues and ensuring that we try to make things as smooth as possible. So of course, the solution to all of this, to all of these queries and concerns, is that we need to get a lot better at architecture and planning. Again, some very wise words there from David at InfoWorld. Of course, we need to make sure everyone is kept informed, and we also need to follow an architecture-based approach to ensure that that is done. So we can map out and plan all the various stages in our roadmap, especially for a cloud migration, which we'll go through today. And we can also make sure that everyone involved in that cloud migration, anyone that needs to be a contributor to the data perhaps, or that is affected or impacted in some way by the cloud migration, is certainly having their concerns heard and that they're being kept informed. We do actually have quite a few success stories about where companies have fallen short, and I'm sure many of you have seen them out there in the community as well. But we'll certainly go through some of the best practice and what we've learned in terms of planning out a cloud migration and road mapping strategy. So I'll now pass over to Peter, and we'll start going through some of those steps.
Thank you very much, Liam. So today we'll be focusing on cloud migration, and there's 5 stages that we'll be going through in this presentation to give you an idea of the essential elements to consider for a cloud migration strategy. Stage 1 involves the preparation and construction of a business case. Stage 2 involves discovering the applications and data you have that can be used in assessing the application's cloud readiness. Stage 3 will involve identifying the KPIs that are important to your business, as these will help in stage 4, where we consider the different cloud migration strategies and try to make an informed, objective decision about which path to take. Stage 3 and 4 can occur a bit in iterative fashion, where you may need to refine the KPIs and metrics used to help select the best path. Finally, Liam will take us through stage 5, the post-migration stage, where we're looking at operations and optimizations. So in the initial stages of putting together a business case or preparing for cloud migration, one of the first questions that might be asked is, why cloud? So you've seen from some of the earlier stats presented by Liam, and perhaps some people aren't aware of the benefits of cloud, or in some cases, they jump with both feet into a migration effort without planning. IT professionals do certainly seem to agree that cloud will add value. One of our partners, Capita, identified that 86% of IT decision makers agree that the benefits of cloud are compelling enough to outweigh the downsides. And that can be seen in some of the areas that we've shown here. The benefits in not being tied to specific on-premise infrastructure can be seen in the flexibility and freedom to scale in many dimensions, whether it be CPU, memory, storage, or network speed, amongst others. The portability offered by not being tied to physically located infrastructure can be crucial in times like these that we've seen in the last few months with the COVID pandemic. The cost savings of only paying for the specific configuration required for your application can be significant. These are just some of the benefits that we need to convince the stakeholders of. As is often the case, it's good practice to start with the endpoint you want to achieve. So ask yourself, what information and KPIs will be most powerful in informing and influencing decisions? That's what you should aim to pull together. Cloud migration should be both a business and IT journey. The key aspect is a common understanding. Everyone needs to be involved and understand what the end goal is. It'd be quite easy to just have someone say, can we migrate this app to the cloud? But before you ask that question, you need to analyze both the benefits and downsides of migrating, considering also the users that would be affected, and ultimately the impact of any change. So lay out a plan, link it to specific company goals such as cost reduction, increasing speed, or improving the employee experience, and this should lead to having an effective business case. The process undertaken to create the business case can help companies remove friction from adoption of cloud, as well as identify the key stages and costs of cloud adoption. Another thing to consider is not to jump in straight away without some form of pilot or proof of concept, so you can really understand and refine some of the benefits that could be achieved. Speak to different lines of business, different users, both employees and potentially customers, and then you can evaluate the different cloud technologies before jumping in. Hopefully we'll give you some ideas about how you can put these benefits together throughout this presentation. One of the things to consider, of course, is road mapping, and we've done some presentations on this in the past. At the start, you might be thinking of the benefits and the outcomes, but as you progress, you need to start thinking about how you can convey this to different stakeholders. So from an enterprise architecture perspective, this comes down to the types of elements you're capturing. So for example, you might be looking at the services involved, the supporting infrastructure, business strategies, projects, application portfolios, risk mitigation aspects, and so on. But consider what your team considers important. It might be vastly different from what your business stakeholders consider important. There's some great challenges involved, but as we get better at architecting this stuff, we get better at planning cloud migration efforts, and then the outcomes will be much more beneficial to the business. So everyone on this call should be familiar in one way or another with portfolio analysis. Even if you're brand new to enterprise architecture, you would have probably done portfolio analysis at some point, even if you don't realize it. If you've ever created a spreadsheet or a table or a simple list of things to try to bring order and structure to, that's portfolio analysis. Let's take a look at this from a cloud perspective. Where do we start? Discovery. We all know how important getting over this first essential hurdle is. Without a decent data set, the architecture team is flying blind. You may want to think about applications and infrastructure, dependencies across your architecture, performance requirements, regulatory or security considerations, and integrations with external systems. There's quite a lot to consider there. A lot of this consideration is down to data discovery and good relationships with lines of business and application owners. However, architects also have some new techniques at their disposal to build a solid, useful data set quickly. We've got integrations with systems such as ServiceNow, Technopedia, and SharePoint. They can work wonders to help keep data fresh. Co-ownership of data using editable cloud-based data registers and lists can help ease the burden. You don't want to or need to be the bottleneck if the real owners of the data can be outsourced and used for data discovery and maintenance. You'll see a bit later how we're able to use some more modern techniques like machine learning or algorithms to help you predict or calculate values to assist in filling those data gaps. But before getting into that, we need to assess the current state where there are some key areas to consider. There are a lot of other factors across different domains that need to be taken into consideration when planning a cloud migration project. And when it comes to addressing the current state, I just want to quickly highlight some questions you may want to consider while building these lists of portfolios, starting with the business domain. Will cloud solutions be accepted by the business owner? What's the risk tolerance level of the business towards a cloud migration? What's the business criticality of an application? For technology considerations, you might need to know how resilient the network infrastructure needs to be. Is there a requirement for high availability, automatic failover, disaster recovery? For applications, we might need to ask the application owners things like, is the given application still in the planning phase? Is it too late to change its path? Does the application need a technical refresh? Rather than migrating the application to cloud infrastructure as is, would it make sense to replace it with a native cloud solution instead? Could it be split into modular services? What level of effort is required to do that? Then there's security considerations, which is often a big topic within cloud. Are there requirements such as network isolation, VPNs, firewalls, or whitelisting? Who's responsible for authentication and authorization? Is there SSO that needs to be integrated? What security controls are in place at the cloud vendor, and are they sufficient? Is continuous monitoring required? These are some of the things that are going to shape how you build your cloud portfolios. From a data perspective, which often goes hand in hand with the security to protect that data, there are also some concerns. Are there any confidentiality, privacy regulations that prevent moving to cloud? Like a good portion of the world, Asia's data privacy frameworks remain highly fragmented, so careful consideration needs to occur here. What's the level of data transfer between the application and the end user? Are there any high load or lag considerations there? And the last domain that we may need to consider is around integrations. A lot of the applications you use these days are typically interacting with other services or applications or sharing data. So if you lift one application out of where it is and move it into the cloud, what other applications would be impacted or even require a migration themselves? So you need to ask, what are the dependencies of your applications to other applications? And do certain groups of applications need to be ideally migrated together? There are, of course, many questions to ask, but getting back to building an initial portfolio across these areas can at times seem daunting. There are a few techniques that you can leverage when building data sets. One of the first things people may tend to do is send out surveys to try and build their inventory, but that's a relatively manual task. So you may look to where you can integrate with other existing tools and leverage what data that they may already have. But how do you best track applications and prevent duplication with different data sets and sources? A tip from one of our existing APAC clients, Reliance, who are based in India. They presented during our 2019 Digital Enterprise Architecture Summit and spoke about working with the IT and security teams to ensure that all applications have what's referred to as an EA ID, which is logged in the EA repository before it's promoted into production. This ensures that it can be tracked and decisions reviewed at key moments. Once you've located all your sources of data, you might have so many lists, spreadsheets, and data sets that would be much more useful if they weren't full of empty cells. One solution to that is leveraging machine learning to help in the data collection. What is machine learning? It's one of those concepts that I'm sure we could spend the rest of the afternoon talking about on its own. We could look at how Amazon uses machine learning to show the most trustworthy reviews, or how PayPal uses it for transactional fraud detection and so on. You can take the guesswork out of essential business decisions. From our perspective, machine learning can make predictions based on other information already available. As you start filling in data, and as that data becomes more mature, then the machine learning algorithm becomes more sophisticated and more accurate, and can infer what it believes to be a good guess at missing values, along with the confidence of those guesses, and leaves a human to confirm if it was on the right track or not. It's often easier for us to confirm or deny a point of data as being correct than us to come up with that data ourselves. You just need to ensure that there's no heavy dependence on it, as people ultimately still need to make decisions. We, of course, need to remember that machine learning outputs are just suggested values, and your team will still have to accept or, of course, reject the proposed values. But thinking ahead, in general, machine learning has a huge potential in the EA space, and one day you might find full architecture structures and models being suggested and built from machine learning. So onto the design phase. This phase goes hand in hand with the portfolio discovery. You're trying to take into consideration what migration strategies you want to deploy. Modern cloud migration is essentially trying to focus on some KPIs to help ensure there's a consistent story being told. Having the portfolios available provides a transparent approach so everyone in the organization understands each phase and what the outcome is. The core metrics that you have captured will tend to influence some of those KPIs as well. So really what you want to focus on, some of the core metrics so you can provide clear direction quickly. You'll then be able to provide a compelling case for change. You might have a lot of the IT-based metrics, but that's not always the case with the business-based metrics, be it cost or user experience and so on. And you do want these metrics to remain current and relevant. In selecting your metrics, you need to focus on what's important. James Bashford, the technical architect at an investment firm, outlined 4 useful rules of thumb during our Digital Enterprise Architecture Summit last year to help guide architects. Try not to collect every field imaginable, otherwise you'll be there for years. Try to avoid free-form text because you won't be able to use the data for high-level analysis or calculations. Step away from the detail and view the estate as a whole. Use drop-down lists or pick lists instead. Don't collect any data that you don't have a use for. You always have to ask yourself why. If you don't have a use for the data, then excess data can complicate and slow down what you're trying to do. And don't attempt to collect data that you don't have a source for. For example, sentiment towards an application that you've never gone through an exercise to survey about is likely to trip up what you're trying to achieve. So after consideration, you'll need to narrow down your assessment to a select few metrics. A big element of successful enterprise architecture is informing, influencing, and motivating. We recommend using dashboards as part of regular workshops and storytelling sessions to keep the line of business and stakeholders on side and informed. Note strong dashboards focus on a few key metrics. Often those may be cost metrics, but experience metrics such as employee or customer experience could also be underpinned by technical metrics and calculated via algorithms. Dashboards which show progress, such as providing a snapshot of current and future states, can also be effective. So there are usually 6 main strategies to choose from for cloud migration, but these by no means exist in isolation. Most companies tend to opt for a lift and shift approach initially, and you'll find that other strategies then get adopted further down the line to enhance and improve the outcome. Visually, you can see how some of these migration strategies might differ, but common stages include the initial discovery phase and also the final validation and production phases. One important thing to highlight here is that regardless on the strategy for change, a proof of concept is going to be crucial for determining feasibility quickly and effectively. So we're going to give a little focus on 3 of these strategies, which are the most common, and quickly explain some of the benefits. Because it's important at this stage to understand what the changes actually would entail. The big 3 we talk about here are some of the more popular options, and certainly ones we can provide more context around rather than retire and retain, which are hopefully self-explaining. So the first one here is rehosting, which is taking the application almost as is and hosting it on a server in the cloud. GE Oil and Gas found that without any cloud optimizations, it could save 30% of its costs simply rehosting applications and databases in the cloud. In this scenario, typically on-premise servers are no longer taking up office space and costing excessive amounts to keep running and operational. Should a company choose to only engage this approach for their cloud migration, the most notable drawbacks is that they are only dipping their feet in the water. But the key benefits here are the speed of migration, probably reduce risk. You're just simply transplanting the application into the cloud. And you've got a broad ecosystem of cloud providers to choose from. So re-platforming involves making a few cloud optimizations during the migration and shaping the application towards being more cloud native. For example, you might upgrade the operating system or use some cloud technologies to provide enhancements without the application itself needing to be changed too significantly. It's usually a phase for evolving an application towards being cloud native. The added benefits are that it's not too difficult for experienced engineers, which could be those who have just gone through a rehosting strategy elsewhere. And the immediate benefit around decreased management costs, higher availability, and costs that are more aligned to consumption. Rounding out our big three is refactoring. It's important to know which applications are used the most, as well as which ones could benefit the most for this kind of scenario. Your database in a virtual machine might be swapped out, not just for an AWS RDS instance, but you could also break it out into multiple database types in the same stack. Code could be deconstructed and decoupled to run in modern managed cloud native technologies such as AWS Lambda, aka functions as a service. There's no servers for you to manage there. A huge advantage of refactoring legacy applications for the cloud is that while this process is occurring, the same legacy systems can continue to run locally without affecting productivity. The key difference when an application is refactored is that it not only pulls data from cloud storage for analysis, but it also completes its analytics and computations within the cloud as well. Some of the benefits here are probably longer term cost reduction. So the finance team will love you. Increased resilience, which customers and employees will thank you for. Responsive to business and external events, good or bad. And you're fully exploiting cloud technologies and innovation. We've mentioned that cloud native term a couple of times, and really what we mean here is the approach of building and running applications that fully exploit the advantages that a cloud delivery model proposes. It's about how things are deployed, not necessarily where. These advantages include near limitless computing power on demand, modern data and application services, containerization, and continuous or agile delivery. You can apply a maturity model to this too. We don't really have time to go through all of these aspects, but some fundamental ones to point out are an API first design, a microservices architecture approach, 12 factors or principles to application design. Again, this is about moving towards such principles such as cloud first. A few other areas to look out for when deciding on a strategy, the common pitfalls or oversights, which we refer here to as dark clouds. Some of the red flags can include lift and shift migrations, where legacy apps are moved wholesale into the public cloud with little regard for refactoring or architecting with cloud advantages in mind. So you're simply just deciding to lift and shift all of them without more analysis there. It could be management and non-technical considerations. Again, those are some of the people who will be affected by the migration. Time spent integrating and securing cloud applications during and after migration, budget or return on investment, and other long-term orientations. Once you go to cloud, you may not be able to go back easily. So I'll now hand over to Liam, who will continue on from here.
Thank you, Peter. So we've looked at getting ready and planning, of course, your cloud migration roadmap, your architecture, road mapping strategy here. But that's, of course, only really half the journey. Peter also touched on the transition states, such as production and versus future states. But it's quite important to remember that cloud is not a destination. It's certainly a journey and one that's continuous. So looking at the operation and optimization aspects of your cloud migration strategy is very critical as you go through that phase, but also into the future. We also, of course, need to look at mitigating those issues, which Peter mentioned on the last slide. So where do we start in this part of the business planning? We need to understand, of course, the current state is a moving target. And this is why, as we said at the start, we need to get better at architecture and planning. Of course, keeping data current is key to all of this. So as you can see here, we have a portfolio which is being kept up to date by a few different users actually. And that can be embedded in any type of collaboration tool. So it doesn't necessarily need to be that architects are the data steward or the go-between or the bottleneck. Everyone can now get involved with updating information. It doesn't necessarily need to be by some third-party system such as Excel or round-tripping through another system altogether. You can embed this in an application that people feel very comfortable with and are used to. And that allows you to also have conversations around the data as well. So, you know, having these separate one-to-one communications with various people, such as emails or perhaps just water cooler conversations, you can start to have grouped conversations around the data in your architecture to ensure that that data isn't going stale. And of course, this requires continuous monitoring as well, beyond the actual migration itself. So it's fine to go through all of these steps and of course, observe all of these things as you're doing your cloud migration or as you're planning. But post-migration, it's very important to ensure that we're continually monitoring these things. And of course, we need to look at not only those micro adjustments that we're making at the data level, maybe every day, but we also need to look at the large adjustments and of course plan for future state scenarios. So again, at the very start of this session today, we talked about some things that you can't plan for, but you can make accommodations for certain risks that might be on the horizon. And with all this data, and of course a current state and future state, we're able to conduct what if analysis and show trade-offs between where we are now and where we might be in the future. That might be at a project level, that might be simply a time level, maybe this year versus next year, or it could be in relation to any type of project that we want to endeavor or embark on. We need to, of course, compare cloud architectures against the current state to highlight changes across the business for all of our stakeholders as well, and really communicate what the benefits are, but also what the steps are along that process and what those changes might look like. And that, of course, brings us to our next point, which is good architecture makes the invisible visible. Of course, what we've talked about so far in the optimization, I should say, stage, gave you a tongue twister there. We need to, of course, consider what the architect's role is in all of this. You know, you're thinking, you know, maybe your day-to-day role right now is being that data steward, and you might be thinking, well, if that's no longer the case, what role do I now play? And the important part to think about here is that the architect is not necessarily needing to be that bottleneck. We don't need to have that middleman, as it were. We can have everyone collaborate and contribute to the architecture, but architects still need to focus on making the invisible visible. And I'll share with you an important quote here that we've found from Hillman Curtis, and we really believe in this. So the quote is, "Your goal is to listen, observe, understand, sympathize, empathize, and synthesize, and glean insights that enable you to make the invisible visible." So it's about bringing together all those disparate sources of data, all those various different places across your organization. And it's a conversation that we have every day with architects around the world. And half of their job is running around from place to place or system to system or database to database and departments to find all of this information and bring it together to create that visibility. So all of this requires, really good architecture requires visibility of the current technical infrastructure and business requirement landscapes. And that requires a lot of input and expertise from the EA team. Of course, it's not all about just bringing together data. In fact, life is getting better and easier for EAs, and all of this doesn't need to be a manual process. So once you've brought all that data together, you don't necessarily need to be so concerned or so focused on doing manual processes to analyze and look at it. You can actually work quite smart by leveraging certain functionalities or features such as machine learning and algorithms that we see in all great tools in the EA space today. So you can see here actually on the screen, we're looking at the capabilities, our capability map, covering our operating processes and our management and support processes, and what applications are relying or being used by those capabilities in order to function. And the heat map that you're seeing there is essentially showing those business stakeholders or showing people that you might report to how many applications being used in each of their capabilities, so the complexity of them and where the focus needs to be, perhaps in a rationalization project or a cost-cutting project. But using these algorithms, we can start to predict outcomes objectively. You don't need to just be an oracle, just say, this is what we think is going to happen, or this is what we propose could happen. You can start to look at all this information from a data perspective. It's not just diagrams anymore. And you can start to, of course, then score key areas of concerns of the business itself. So all those stakeholder concerns, those requirements that you gathered through your initial planning phases, you can start to address those and really provide some insights and outputs. Most importantly, all of these can be automated, and we'll go through a couple of examples coming up actually about how that can work and some of the benefits you can get. But you can automate the calculation of these metrics that are defining your cloud migration strategies. So what next? So far, we've looked at quite a few things. We've got a plan, we've got some architecture, and we've got some metrics. So what? Really, it's all good to have all these things, but we also need to make sure that we're protecting them in some way. And I'm not sure if any of you are on TikTok or if you have any of your kids that are on TikTok, but there's actually quite a lot of cybersecurity influencers on there, which have come up with some great terms. One of those is being, whenever you think about cloud, and this is a great way to explain it to business holders, simply replace cloud with someone else's computer. And you can then have those conversations about security, or thinking about security at least. So we need to think about our security strategy overall, especially when looking at a cloud migration. It's very impractical to simply lift and shift. And this is one of the root causes of migration failure when it comes to a cloud migration strategy. We need to consider and understand the concerns of the business and the key questions that we're seeing on screen, for example. We need to consider the data flows, server communication methods, and of course, analyzing the entire scenario before we commence on this migration plan. It's very important here, of course, to not confuse security and compliance. Security and risk is quite often, but not always, under the organization's control. Of course, being forced to accept some regulatory compliance is not. So, for example, as I'm sure we've all been exposed to recently, stay-at-home notices, border controls, restrictions around our own business. These are things that we are forced to accept, and we have to learn to work within those bounds. We can, of course, create risk assessments and differentiate these compliance requirements from security. And we need to consider that the risks of perhaps not innovating or adopting new technologies. And we've seen that this year in so many different scenarios. There's many case studies out there now and many examples of organizations that just simply weren't able to innovate or adapt fast enough and unfortunately have had to close their doors. So let's walk through a bit of an example. First of all, I want to cover off a slide that was actually picked out from a presentation from one of our clients at the Digital Enterprise Architecture Summit last year. This was from the UK's largest cybersecurity company, Sophos. So they talked through how they, on top of their application estate, were able to manage risks and threats in their own business. And we'll go through this in a bit more detail now. So first of all, you need to look at holding your application catalog as data in a suitable tool. There's no point, of course, having it as just an image or perhaps a PowerPoint or any other artifact. It needs to be held as data. That's very critical, very crucial. It's then, of course, important to add properties that reflect what drives security probability and the impact to your application portfolio. You need to collect the initial data, and if you don't know, you should be scoring negatively. Unknowns carry an unknown risk, and you should be digging deeper. Sophos, in their own way, were able to go for breadth first, so they can understand the size of the elephant before they eat it, so to speak. It's then, of course, very important to define and test algorithms that continually score your application catalog. So there's no point having a set and forget principle. You need to continuously look at that and be continually updating. They were able to calculate security probability, security impact, and then the overall security rating. And these scripts are able to run regularly and on an automated basis, so they can improve the information as those scores change and feed that back to the enterprise and the wider stakeholders. They can, of course, then work with those application stakeholders to continually refine and improve the data back again. So they may provide some analysis to stakeholders who then provide their own feedback and other changes that might need to be accommodated. And of course, there's no point in going through all this if there wasn't some key benefit. So Sophos was able to, through this exercise, have that security score as a very important metric in their reporting. And they're able to continually track and use it as an instrument to show just one way that enterprise architecture is adding value to the organization. Secondly, we of course do need to consider technical debt. So looking here, cloud migration and technical debt can go hand in hand. In fact, they're quite often terms that are considered interchangeably. So technical debt, enterprise debt, architecture debt. But we need to look at here the basic questions that we should be able to answer: the what, the how, the who, the why, and the when. A previous webinar that we hosted was purely focused on this topic, but we just want to highlight some of the quick takeaways from that. Of course, key to this, or key to part of the portfolio analysis, is that we are looking at these questions that drive that initial business case. We need to consider the risks of debt, the regulatory compliance that might come into play, the impact this debt has on our entire infrastructure and technology landscape, and the data we hold and how that's used, or the services that we deliver to customers. And that's the business case, and that's what ultimately will motivate action. So motivating action and ownership is quite important. And that's, of course, our third point here. Ultimately, through all of this, it's important to talk about cloud migration strategies and road mapping architectures, but at the end of the day, it all comes down to people. It's often a neglected element of cloud migration, and there's two elements to this that I'll mention. First of all, you need to consider from a data perspective. You need to make sure that users are aware of which areas need populating, what their role is within this transformation project, and how that data they contribute will be used. Of course, when communicating, and this is the second point, you need to remember that the stopwatch is ticking. So you need to focus on a few strong metrics. There's no point providing metrics or a whole catalog of them, a portfolio of them. You need to focus on just a few key strong metrics that are relevant to each stakeholder. Data-driven, of course, is a way of having that competitive edge of users that are wanting to enhance the data and to drive results and insights for other users. So you can have that data-driven aspect on top of that diagram-driven side of things. And there's a lot of talk in the community about data-driven, diagram-driven architectures at the moment. Of course, sharing content means more people are involved, and then there's more eyes on the problem. So as you can surface all this information, you can see the data behind your diagrams, behind your assets. You can now start to communicate this out to the business and ensure that everyone is looking at the same page. Sometimes that might be a web page, sometimes that might be a PDF. And of course, smart data is more so for bringing attention to key areas and allowing users to utilize algorithms to help them. So all that information, as we're all bringing it in from different sources and it's being analyzed using various algorithms, we consider that smart data, and that allows people to really focus their attention on key areas of the business. So we'll look at a couple of road mapping examples to tie everything together today. Now remember, these are simply outputs. You still need to do all of the architecture work. So you can't just kick back and relax and think that it's going to do itself. You need to still put together all of the data, all of the strategies, and all of the analytics yourself. It's important to not lose sight here on how you're going to communicate this to stakeholders. So dashboards provide a fantastic way of doing them. They're very business friendly. Most people can understand them at a glance, and it's very easy to then have those conversations around the data as we were talking about earlier. So dashboards can be set up with a collection of views, which is specific to each user role, to each user or role or domain, and they can help you communicate much more effectively. And we'll go through a couple of examples here that have proven beneficial to some of our customers. So the first one we'll look at is road mapping application data security compliance. The audience here might be a chief EA or a data security team. It might be a compliance manager or some other decision maker. And what they're looking to achieve or ask is what applications are creating data security risks. They need to, of course, consider all the options and consider all the information and look at the actions that need to be taken. What applications need to be prioritized for a data security project. Maybe that's in response to GDPR, maybe that's in response to PIPA, or some other framework that's out there that you're working within. The reason why this works, of course, is decision makers are able to quickly see a complete overview of the entire state of things, how many applications might be compliant and how many might not be compliant. And of course, that's one of the key points to GDPR in itself over in the EU. You've got to answer those questions when asked from the regulators. So algorithms are doing the analysis for us. So it takes away a lot of the burden and a lot of the work that we normally be required. And it keeps all that information up to date. Of course, stakeholders with this dashboard can drill in and see the details as well. So it's not just the high-level metrics, those pie charts, those column charts, the petition diagram. They can actually see all the detail in that catalog side by side. They can, of course, record their decision right there on the page as well. They can provide a feedback mechanism, or they can have those conversations around the dashboard, again, in their own collaboration app. And this, of course, works for both self-service and presentations. So you no longer need to rely on just the PowerPoint slides. You don't need to use this PDF report so much. You can have this data live and use it for presentation purposes to your audiences. Of course, one of the big aspects we've talked about today is road mapping technology planning. So cloud migration certainly falls into that, and that's another one of our examples. So take a look at how that might appear for a particular audience. Again, that might be your chief EA, or it could be your technology standards and lifecycle management team. Of course, keeping all this data up to date, and you're probably thinking, especially from a technology planning perspective, is very time consuming. Most organizations have application numbers in the thousands, if not tens of thousands. You can use tools such as Technopedia to do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. So you can look at things such as the application life cycles or the server hardware, and all of that can be brought from these other libraries that are available online and kept up to date automatically. So you don't need to manually update those timelines, those horizons yourself. Of course, we need to consider here the decisions to be made as well. So perhaps we're looking at what technologies are creating risk for the enterprise, what technologies need to have their status changed, and what will be the impacts of those changes as well. Of course, then we need to look at the actions that will be taken from those decisions. Perhaps we need to change the status of those technologies or identify target technology to replace an existing technology. And the reason why this all works, of course, again, these visualizations are very business friendly. They're very easy to read, and it makes it super simple for people to explore the architecture in their own way. And one of our last examples here, this is now starting to pivot and look at the extremely high level. So we can look at our current state versus our target state. And in particular, we can look at the risks or the impact versus the probability of a certain decision. And we can look at that from our overall current state versus our target state and what the impact of that might be. We can also start to assess external issues. So we recently actually added to Abacus the PESTLE framework, or PESTLE, depending on how you pronounce it, to look at specifically political, environmental, social, technological, legal, and economic factors which might be affecting your business and you can bring all that analysis back to your stakeholders and say, we know why these changes in our businesses are happening, and that's because of X, Y, Z. It might be external, it might be internal. So you can use these different frameworks to start to bring some meaning to your data and your analysis. So one final comment from me, one that you'll hopefully leave with today, is what to consider when thinking of cloud migration. We've talked about these areas in detail, but these 10 thoughts are what should prompt questions. So the ones that you see here on screen, such as how does our application scale? What operational changes are necessary? How to ensure security is by design and not an afterthought? If you can plan for these changes and you can make your team aware of these touch points, then you can confidently start a cloud transformation project and reach a successful conclusion. Before we wrap up, I just want to make one quick announcement. We do, of course, have a Digital Enterprise Architecture Summit coming up next month. So this is the second one we've now hosted. Last year was extremely successful. We had many hundreds of architects from all around the world join many different sessions. We're running this over 2 days in July next month, and we'll have sessions in each different time zone, each different block that we work in. So there'll certainly be some here for people in APAC, and we strongly recommend that you join us. It's a free summit, so please do come along. Please register via our website, and hopefully we'll see you there. That's pretty much everything for today. Thank you again for joining. We will take some questions in just a moment, but if you'd like to connect with us, please join us in our community. We do have various groups on LinkedIn, Twitter, and of course our own Abacus community. We actually have another webinar coming up just next week, which is going to be hosted by Harrison, who you heard at the very start, and Zach as well, who's one of our pre-sales and support engineers. And they'll be focused on looking at Abacus in quite detail and designing your enterprise architecture using it. If you do have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. You can shoot me an email there. We will, of course, send around a recording of this presentation and the slides as well. But in the meantime, feel free to download our ebook on Cloud Optimized Enterprise Architecture as well. And I'll now pass back to Peter. I see we've got a few minutes left for questions, so please do pop those in the chat window.
I think there was one question from someone about mentioning of outsourcing data collection to users within a specific domain, like application owners. How can you bring in those users without spending a lot of time upskilling them to a new product?
I could probably answer that one. Liam, you might be able to add a bit to the end. I guess with Abacus, we've got two main products: Abacus Studio, which is like the heavy lifting desktop application for the core EA team, and Abacus Enterprise, which is the web-based application, dashboards and so on, and that's for the entire organization. So in this scenario, depending on what you wanted from them, you could do as little as providing the app owners just with a single catalog, like a link directly to that catalog of the applications that's their responsibility to maintain. So you could configure that catalog so it's only showing the properties and things that they're responsible for them so they'll see everything that's relevant to them, and it'd be quite intuitive to use on its own. They don't even necessarily need to learn anything about the product outside of what they're told to keep up to date there. Of course, you'd probably try and integrate Abacus Enterprise dashboards into your intranet or embedded in Microsoft Teams or something like that. But at its sort of lowest level and least upskilling required, that's probably the way to go there. You probably also set up permissions if there are properties that you don't want the app owner to modify, but they need to be able to see them or read them. You could probably set that up with permissions.
All right. So I guess we'll just. Yeah. Sorry, Peter. You can continue.
Yeah, I was just saying. I don't know if Liam has anything else to add to that one.
No, exactly right. I think you pretty much nailed it there, Peter. I mean, just to sort of add, I guess, more of the motion that people would feel. You ask people to update a spreadsheet or fill out information, they might groan a little bit, especially if they have to learn an entire new application on top of their already busy lives and busy roles. I'm sure they'll be very appreciative if they can simply add that to just a web interface or some method that they already use, and that's why we talked quite a lot about embedding that in a collaboration platform today. So removing those resistances to data entry and keeping the data up to date is very critical.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for your time today. If you do have any other questions, feel free to send them along to liam.ryan@evolutionsoftware.com. Not me. You can send them to me either as well, peter.collins@evolutionsoftware.com. Thanks all for your time.